I will get to the charts in due time, just to briefly sort of summarize them. Maybe I'll wait till everyone has them, so that you can refer to them as we go along in the class. Does everyone? OK, they're still going back. Maybe accelerate things slightly by passing out a couple more in the back. OK, well, those in the back will have these in a second. The rest of you already have your chart. What I've printed out on the first page is what is called a dollar index. That is the dollar basically against a basket of currencies, including, historically the German mark, later the euro, the Swiss franc, the Japanese yen, some of the other so-called hard currencies around the world, such as the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar. You can see, basically, you try to focus on the sharp points. The main one you should keep in mind today is the peak in 1985. Why the dollar was so strong in 1985. Conversely, why it was weakening in the 1970s and why it has been weakening since 2000, more recently. The next chart is gold, which in some ways you might call an inverse chart to the dollar. One way, of course, of charting the progress of the dollar, or rather more recently the fall of the dollar, is of course by comparing it to gold, the spot price of the dollar versus gold. Now here you can see, in some ways the peak was similar, except here, 1985, where the dollar was strong, gold was weak. It's almost like a pendulum effect, not quite the same. When the dollar is strong, gold tends to be weak, and vice versa. Okay, so keep that in mind. You should also keep in mind, if you look at this next chart, which in some ways is even more dramatic, and it has a kind of annotated flex points, you might say, with events and their consequences, the prices of crude oil in dollar terms. You can see that there was an immense spike in the 1970s, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, which we talked about. That is the kind of third major Arab-Israeli war, followed by, of course, the famous OPEC oil embargo. Oil prices then settled down briefly, and then the thing which basically shot them up the most was the onset of the Iran-Iraq war in basically 1979, also in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. You'll also notice, interestingly, that oil prices hit a trough, that is a low point, right around 1985. Interesting. So 1985, you had weak gold, weak oil, and a strong dollar. Conversely, at the end of the 1970s, if you remember from your gold chart from last week, right, when oil prices were peaking, the gold price also went through the roof, up to almost $900 an ounce from, if you remember, $35 an ounce in the early 1970s. Now, the last chart is a bit harder to follow. This is the chart of the interest rate. Essentially, this is the prime lending rate of the Federal Reserve, which then determines the lending rate of American banks. This chart doesn't follow quite the same patterns as the other one, but you can still see a very similar peak. You can also see the reason the world is currently being flooded with dollars. If you look over to the far end of the chart, that is the present day, you can see the interest rate is effectively zero right now, which means you can borrow money for free. That is, if you're an insider, if you're connected, and if you're a bank. And that's why everyone is borrowing dollars for free and then sloshing them around the world economy, which has already had immense geopolitical consequences, not least in the Middle East, because, of course, of the spike in commodity prices. Remember that commodity prices, such as, to take it beyond oil and gold, wheat, soybeans, corn, those kinds of things, they also tend to peak when the dollar is weak. Again, it's a bit like a pendulum. So you can read these charts in part to see, that is, historical trends. The thing about them, though, is that people like to say that what matters is kind of the longue durée, the kind of gradual unfolding of events. But on the other hand, you could also flip that around and say that these charts show that what really matters are the short, sharp spikes. That is, the moments when, for one reason or another, people start dumping dollars, dumping bonds, hoarding gold, or hoarding oil. There are always, of course, political shenanigans in the background. That said, you can still discern some larger trends. For example, if you were to look at 1979-1980, you have a weak dollar. You have skyrocketing gold, skyrocketing oil prices. All of those things would suggest, essentially, bad news for the United States. Weak dollar, strong gold, strong oil. Curiously, until about 1970, actually, a strong oil price was good for the United States because the U.S. used to be an oil exporter. Since 1970, however, the U.S. has been a major net importer of oil to the tune of as much as often 50 or 60%. So we're talking just about the kind of post-1970 world. Now, interestingly, if you look at all this stuff, you can see, well, at this time, the late 70s up to 1980, looks like half the world is going communist. You've got, of course, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indochina. We talked about that catastrophe for U.S. foreign policy. South Yemen, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia. I wrote up here the We Are the World song. This is way before your time, but you might have heard of it, right? The Michael Jackson and all of the celebrities of the early 80s, they all got together and, we are the world, we are the children. It was a great piece of humbug, basically, because, of course, what everyone was supposedly saying is we need to be generous and help the poor, starving people of Ethiopia because the rich, greedy capitalist governments are not giving enough money. The whole thing was hogwash, of course. The people of Ethiopia did not lack food. Rather, they had a communist government which was deliberately starving them to death, something that people had forgotten. Grenada in the America's own backyard in the Caribbean, and, of course, Nicaragua, which becomes a flashpoint in the 1980s. Then, of course, aside from the skyrocketing gold price, we had this phenomenon known as stagflation, which essentially means, in a way you might call it the refutation of the so-called Phillips curve in Keynesian economics. That is, you're supposed to have a pendulum between inflation and employment. That is, unemployment goes up, more people lose jobs when inflation is low. If you inflate the economy, supposedly unemployment goes down, that is, people get jobs. In the late 1970s, both unemployment and inflation were going up, thus invalidating the curve, invalidating the principle. Stagflation meaning you had both the debasement of the dollar, the weakening of the dollar, and economic stagnation, negative growth, and then, of course, recession. They coined a term in kind of political parlance. They called it the misery index, a very simple graph where you took the unemployment rate and you simply added it to the inflation rate. In a way, this was like a sort of a dark joke at the expense of Keynesian economics. The idea that these things were supposed to work, again, in this kind of magical tandem. Instead, they were both going up to the point where they peaked at about 20% in, again, this magical year of 1980, the year that gold hit these massive peaks. So you have high unemployment, great misery, not all of it related to inflation, but a good deal related to the general economic crisis. You had America feeling, again, as if its power in the world was sort of at a great ebb. 1980, again, one of these key years. One of my earliest memories, I was about, 5 years old, about to turn 6 at the time, was the 1980 Olympics. Not the Summer Olympics, which the United States boycotted because they were held in Moscow. This was in retaliation for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. But rather the Winter Olympics held in the United States, in which the Soviets did participate. It was actually held in Lake Placid, in my old stomping grounds in upstate New York, way before your time. But you might have seen there was a movie out a couple of years ago, not a real big budget movie, starring Kurt Russell as the hockey coach. You see, the Soviet hockey team hadn't lost in 20 years. They were invincible. And besides which, the Soviet Union being, again, a communist country where the state controls everything, they were, of course, professionals. They were mercenaries, basically. They played for money. Or in the Soviet terms, it wasn't so much the money that mattered as the fact, you got the perks, the special apartment. You were essentially a kind of member of the elite class with all of the privileges pertaining thereto. Thus, their hockey players, they were professionals in the literal sense of the term. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s. America then was still a little naive about the Olympics, so we fielded what were called amateur teams. That is not professional athletes, but college students, people your age. So what it literally was the U.S. fielding a hockey team of like 19 and 20-year-old boys facing these Soviet professional monster athletes who were not just older and stronger and bigger, but who literally hadn't lost in 20 years. And anyway, long story short, the Americans won. It was called the Miracle on Ice. And It's interesting. I mean, in some ways, I suppose you could say it was a little bit like what happened the other day with bin Laden. You know, America is like beset by bad news all over the place. Everyone's dumping the dollar. Everyone is dumping on the U.S. U.S. kind of, psychology has gone viral in the sense that everyone thinks that all problems are getting worse. And then they had this one little burst of good news. The call, actually, on ABC was classic. A guy called Al Michaels. The U.S. was up 4-3, but the Soviets were getting off shot after shot on goal in the last few minutes. And everyone thought, of course, the Soviets would inevitably come back, because they always did, because they were fitter than the other teams, they were stronger. So the Americans even thought at the end, even ahead 4-3, they would lose. And when the clock finally ticked down, you know, he literally said, "Do you believe in miracles?" And so that was what it felt like in America, the first bit of good news in like 10 years, 1980. Things were not going America's way. Vietnam, Cambodia, Indochina, Africa, economics, the misery index, things were going pretty badly. Now, the notion, too, that there was nothing that could be done about it, that these things were all just kind of almost like set in stone. It's interesting because Jimmy Carter had something to do with this. The president who followed, literally followed Ford, but in a way Ford was really just a caretaker in between the Nixon and the Carter presidencies. I'll have to go back a little bit to explain where we got in terms of Carter and his approach to things, because in some ways you could say, you know, he wasn't unlike Obama. He inherited some very serious problems from the previous administrations. It's not entirely fair to blame him for the dilemmas he faced. However, his manner of facing them, I think, in the end made a lot of the problems worse. Many of the problems, of course, went back even before Nixon. You know, when I talked about the inflation, the debasement of the currency, that really began under Kennedy in the early 60s. You know, so economically speaking, you have to go back to the 60s. Nixon probably, because he was from the other party, he maybe had the last chance, if you remember, to stop the inflation. He had this opportunity, that is, to finally let interest rates rise as they should have, you know, to kind of cut off the flood of dollars into the economy. He could have tried to keep the federal budget under control. He could have tried to, that is, defend the dollar against the speculators and say, look, even if it's going to cost us jobs in the short run, we will do the hard thing now in order to have the dollar maintain its value. You remember, instead, he chose reflation, more money printing, and basically killing off Bretton Woods. Literally, if you remember from last week, that meant that foreign governments were no longer allowed to trade in dollars for gold at $35 to the ounce. So that killed off the Bretton Woods system, unleashing inflation kind of across the world, you know, floating currencies up and down. Now, in terms of foreign policy, in some ways Nixon was more successful. And yet, it's a little unfair to blame him for the final events in Vietnam that I talked about with, you know, the embarrassing withdrawal, the cutting off of all aid to the South Vietnamese, and then, of course, eventually the Khmer Rouge, you know, pouring into Phnom Penh. If you remember, by that point, because of Watergate, Nixon was effectively, he was essentially not even really in charge. He had no authority left, and then 1974, when he resigns, Ford, I put him up here, you know, just briefly, almost like as a coda. The one president, I think, as I mentioned, that I've actually met in person, he's not really terribly presidential. I mean, he wasn't even elected. That's one of the reasons he was so weak. Also, because he represented continuity with the Nixon administration, Nixon being discredited by Watergate, you know, he had no ability to get his own policies through Congress. You know, thus they cut off the money for Vietnam. Thus they essentially cut defense spending. They gutted the CIA of really most of its effective agents. You know, it was kind of an overreaction to some real problems. But in foreign policy terms, I think Nixon does deserve at least some of the credit and or blame, depending on one's view of détente. Now, you should write this term down because, of course, if you hadn't heard it before, it's an important term as part of the kind of lexicon of the Cold War and 20th century history. Now, literally what it means, if you know your French, we have a couple people here who I think know French, you know, it's kind of literally a relaxation. You know, the idea being that, you know, you're tense and then you relax a little bit. So the idea is the tense superpower confrontation with the Soviets, you should allow it to calm down and relax a little bit. You know, instead of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with threats and bluster, you should have a period of calm and discussion and maybe summit talks, maybe a few agreements on areas on which you can agree and that sort of thing. The strategic rationale behind it from the perspective of Nixon, and really its kind of intellectual architect was Henry Kissinger, they were trying to extricate America from Vietnam, as gingerly as possible. Their idea being, look, we have to leave while maintaining face and pride. In other words, we need to negotiate from strength. We won't be able to do that unless we can have some way of cutting off the North Vietnamese, basically by playing China off of the Soviet Union. This was the strategy. It was complex, it was intricate, it kind of sort of worked, and then it didn't. The idea was, by opening up China, as the phrase went, literally Nixon visited China. So, Red China was recognized by the United States. They literally used to call it in the newspapers, Red China, because it was not seen as a legitimate government. Taiwan, until 1971, was actually recognized by the US and most of its allies as the legitimate government of China, such that in the Olympics, for example, it used to be much easier to win medals before the Chinese were competing. And now, of course, it's much harder. But so anyway, so they recognized China, just in diplomatic terms. They tried to kind of sort of open up the Chinese economy, although that took a while. Mainly what they were trying to do is to play divide and conquer between the Chinese and the Soviets, to try to convince the Chinese that their interests were different than the Soviets, which was, of course, true, so that the US could play one opposite the other. So that the US hoped then, by leaning on China to cut off arms aid to Vietnam, this would create tensions with the Soviet Union, possibly force the Soviets to do the same. So this policy then, it was kind of like a little bit of a scheme with like billiard balls. One thing was supposed to bounce off the other. You were supposed to kind of promote the Chinese to weaken the Soviet. So the policy of détente then had a strategic point. It was not simply relaxing. They wanted to strengthen the Chinese against the Soviets in order to give America the leverage it needed to essentially withdraw from Vietnam. You could say the thing was kind of sort of working again until Watergate discredited Nixon and all of his works. The whole debacle in Vietnam basically produced this diplomatic humiliation and embarrassment for the Americans, so that in the end you could say the policy didn't really work. In one way, however, it worked very well, not for the Americans, but for the Soviets. It went like this. The US was softening certain strictures regarding things like trade, economic aid, and development. Sometimes it's meant they wanted to export things like grain to the Soviets, and so they wanted to open up the market. It also meant, however, allowing banks to deal with the Eastern Bloc, that is, sometimes giving them loans. The European component of this was called Ostpolitik, that being, of course, German for literally, I suppose, Eastern policy or Eastern politics, associated primarily with Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany. This idea, they use this phrase coexistence. The idea is, look, we don't like communism, but it's here to stay. So maybe what we'll try to do is to alleviate the conditions of life for the people there in the short run, by dealing with these governments as de facto governments that have de facto needs that are in some way legitimate, hoping that then by helping them economically, some of that will trickle down to the people. It's a little bit like the same idea behind foreign aid. Again, you use your wealth to hopefully improve the conditions, particularly in a place like Africa or maybe Latin America. We're now a little more sanguine about this. We're not a little less sanguine about this. We're not so sure that it works now, because years of research have shown that foreign aid, like loans, tends to just go into the pockets of the government and its officials. Back in this era, I think people were maybe a little bit more optimistic and naive about it. I think the best example of how this worked in practice was Ceausescu's Romania. Ceausescu was one of the most grotesque of the Eastern European dictators. Just horrendous conditions. They built this like Pentagon-sized palace, basically, while the country was living in medieval poverty. He and his wife famously had no care or respect for the cares and concerns of the people. They were kind of particularly arrogant. Everyone hated them. They were, in some ways, the epitome of evil for a lot of people in the Eastern Bloc. Weirdly, however, they had what was called most favored nation status with the United States for purposes of trade. Why? Interesting. Ceausescu maintained close relations with both Israel and West Germany, which was unusual, of course, in the Eastern Bloc. So we got a kind of special status. Meanwhile, why did he maintain good relations with Israel and West Germany? Because there were a lot of Jews and Germans in Romania. And he sold them. Basically, exit visas. He ran a racket selling these exit visas at about $5,000 a pop simply to raise money for his cronies. Now, we know this now. In the era, probably people didn't really know the details. But that is how it tended to work in practice. Now, in Soviet terms, it was in some ways more serious. You might have heard this phrase that money is fungible. You know, that is, money can be very easily and rapidly transferred. It is liquid. It moves. You may think that aid that you give to a government goes to one thing. But if the government is able to spend money on that it didn't have to raise, then it has more money to spend on something else. In other words, the more money the US allowed to slosh into the Soviet Union meant the Soviet Union had more money to spend. Now, what do you expect they probably would have spent that money on? Improving the lives of the citizens? Or building nuclear weapons? Arms. So we know for a fact that the Soviets actually achieved parity with the United States. That is, you remember back in the Kennedy era, it was like 17-to-1 superiority for the US. They achieved parity in terms of striking capacity of both medium-range and long-range ICBMs with the US in 1971. By 1974, they had outright superiority. By the end of the 1970s, as part of the reason why all these countries are going communist, they also have a nuclear navy. You know, they have expanded around the world in terms of their naval power, and they now have outright superiority over the United States, which, if you remember, the original strategic equation of the Cold War has now been turned on its head. The US never had enough conventional forces in Europe to oppose the Soviets. They depended on the nuclear monopoly, then nuclear superiority. Now the Soviets have reversed this. So that in literal terms, this is what détente did for the Soviet Union. The opening up of trade, loan agreements, and so on simply allowed the Soviets to have more money at hand, which they spent on weapons. You know, there were other little odd elements too. There was this thing called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is still operational. It has to do with the status of Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union. So that today, like if you're in New York City and you go to Brighton Beach, there are all these Soviet Jews who came over in the early 1970s who still don't speak English. It's very strange. Literally, it's a whole area of New York where like they don't speak English, where you're visiting basically the Soviet Union circa 1971. It had to do, again, with supposedly leveraging trade concessions in exchange for human rights concessions on the part of the Soviet Union, which were always, shall we say, something of a mirage, because all the Soviet Union was really doing was allowing people to leave that it didn't really like anyway. In exchange, it got things like, you know, money, goods, grain, meat, loans. So in economic terms, you could say that the policy, whether it backfired or not, I suppose that is arguable. However, it definitely benefited the Soviet Union. Whether it benefited the United States equally is, I think, unclear. Reagan had a great phrase about détente, which he criticized. You know, Reagan, although Republican, did not really like the Nixon policy. He said, I'm going to try to do my Reagan accent here. He said, yes, détente, isn't that what a farmer has with his turkey until Thanksgiving? You know, of course, turkey's being slaughtered and butchered on Thanksgiving so that they'll end up on your dinner plate. So that is the idea. The Soviets are just using you until they're eventually going to, no, I don't know, kill you, but I mean they're eventually going to strike. His idea being, well, they did strike. By the end of the 1970s, they also, I didn't even write Afghanistan on here because I suppose they didn't have control over it, but they also invaded Afghanistan. They were expanding around the world. Again, under cover of the relaxed, improved relations of détente. Now, just briefly on Jimmy Carter, it wasn't really his policy. We don't consider détente to be a Carter-era policy. He didn't really repudiate it, though. I mean, in some ways, you might say that Nixon had an idea of détente from strength. It was supposed to be about, you know, strength, but also negotiation with a worthy adversary. Carter's policy, I mean, my own phrase for it, it's a little bit like, you know, you have a pet dog, you know, and you roll over and you play dead. That was pretty much the Carter policy. No confrontation at all. unilateral disarmament, because that was a big cause, meaning like we will actually spend less on arms and even decommission some of ours, and we'll just kind of hope that the Soviets might do the same. But we won't demand anything of them. Now, literally the Carter policies, some of it had to do with the economic crisis, just the general feeling of impotence, but there was almost a philosophy behind it. It's curious. Some of his aides, I'll quote his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. He said, quote, to oppose Soviet or Cuban involvement in Africa, because a lot of these countries going communist, the Soviets were sort of like using the Cubans as auxiliaries. The idea basically being that the Cubans were more dark-skinned, and so they would not be as resented as, white Soviet officers. It was all very cynical. But anyway, so the idea that we can oppose Soviet-Cuban involvement is futile. That is, there's no reason, there's no way we can oppose it. The world is changing, this is Brzezinski, under the influence of forces no government can control. Carter says America's ability to influence events is, quote, limited. Basically, they did not think America could do much about the problems of the world. It becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're not wrong that probably America's power is waning in the late 1970s. It was. America had less money to spend on foreign affairs. I mentioned the Donald Rumsfeld study. This is briefly in the Ford era, where they said America could no longer even protect the sea lanes, in the eastern Mediterranean. America could no longer resupply Israel if there were a war. America could no longer even guarantee the supply lanes to Japan. This because the Soviet Navy was now circling the oceans. So again, part of it is deliberate, part of it is a passive acceptance, part of it is philosophical. In the end, though, I think it comes down to a lack of will. I mean, if Carter had a virtue, you might say it was almost like excessive honesty. He was actually once asked by a television reporter, how would you grade yourself? Like, would you give yourself an A or a B or a C, on economic policy, on foreign policy? And you might expect as a politician, he would say, well, maybe an A minus. Trying to be like a little bit honest, but still praising himself. Instead, he gave himself like C's and D's and B minuses, which is honest. It's not what you would expect from a politician, however. He also had this phrase. He called it malaise. And he kept using it. It became, again, one of these like self-fulfilling prophecies. I put this on the board last week, but didn't really explain it. It's a bit like decadence, the notion of like the deterioration or decay of, an institution or a civilization. But there's also something psychological to it. It's almost like you're just convincing yourself that you're weak and impotent. And what he meant to say was that like Americans have convinced themselves that they were powerless. But he kept saying it over and over again. And in a way, he was kind of indicting himself and his own administration. He was saying, look, we are powerless, partly because of this mood of powerlessness, which just kept being repeated over and over again. So that Americans, in the end, whether they believed it or not, it wasn't very reassuring. That's part of the reason why this mood that I talked about that was, kind of lifted a little bit like recently, the bin Laden news of the other day, the hockey victory basically over the Soviets. Americans really felt powerless. The world really did seem to be spiraling out of their control. Gasoline prices, oil prices, skyrocketing gold prices. Well, the thing about this, I talked about self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, the thing is, it's true that Carter didn't do much to change these trends. Maybe they weren't his fault originally. The monetary policies, again, went back to Kennedy, had been pursued right on through to his administration. Foreign policy was not his fault. America had lost in Vietnam. Thus, like morale in the military was very low. I talked about how America had even failed in its mission to rescue, well, it didn't fail, but like it lost like 50 soldiers just rescuing some fishermen basically from the Cambodians. Then, of course, famously, Iran, right? You have the taking of American hostages from the US Embassy. I mean, literally by a bunch of college students. I mean, this is how weak and impotent America seemed. The embassy was taken over by a bunch of college students. Yes, some of them had arms, but I mean, it wasn't like some disciplined force. Ahmadinejad was, of course, one of them. He was actually involved in this. At the time, I guess he was about 21 or something like that. And then, of course, Carter's reaction. They sent a couple of helicopters on this rescue mission. One of them got sand in the gears and crashed, and everyone died. And then eventually they decided, well, the accident had alerted the Iranians to what was happening, and so they aborted the mission and they just gave up. You know, very different from obviously what the US just did in Pakistan. They just gave up, basically. They said that there are a couple of jokes running around right on the eve of the presidential election of 1980. You might call them kind of dark, macabre humor. You know, one of them was a little less dark. There was a famous song by, I guess, the Beach Boys called Barbara Ann. It's just, you know, one of those silly beach songs about a woman called Barbara Ann. And so people changed the lyrics to bum bum ba 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 bum bum ba bum Iran, and you get the rest of it, right? The idea was, why isn't America bombing Iran? They just took 430 citizens hostages. The other joke, a little more serious, was this. What is flat and glows in the dark? Tehran, 24 hours after Reagan's inauguration. In other words, everyone thought that if Reagan was elected president, he would actually nuke Tehran. Now, interestingly, as it turned out, I talked about this idea of dogs, you know, having like a small dog that has like a, you know, a loud bark, right, because they're impotent. Reagan, interestingly, because he had this reputation for being this warmonger, I mean, he was literally feared and hated by a lot of people because they thought he really might do something like nuke Tehran. It's not that he ever intended to do this. It's just that he had a reputation for strength and fearlessness. I'm going to tell you something that is pretty amazing. The hostages were held for more than 400 days. They were let go within 24 hours of Reagan's inauguration. Reagan didn't even do anything. In fact, Reagan deployed the military less than any other president in the last 40 years. He had a reputation, however, for belligerence and bellicosity. And the Iranians presumably heard these jokes. They may have heard the joke about bomb Iran, and they may have heard the joke about Tehran glowing in the dark, and they didn't want to take a chance. In the end, Reagan didn't even have to do anything. All he had to do was be elected. But before I get into Reagan and his own views and his own policies, I think I want to take a short break because I think I got an important phone call here. So we're going to take, let me just check the time. Yeah, it's about 2:15. So let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll pick up with Reagan, okay?